Hey class, welcome to Later 20th Century and Contemporary Literature. Yes, here we are at modern times, pretty much, although the authors we're studying don't start necessarily in modern times, but our overview will lead from earlier 20, well, not earlier, but the later 20th century into our contemporary times. And I'm recording from my car, as you may notice. I'm on a road trip with my children, and this is the only place I can record. Yeah, they're all asleep in the hotel room, so I'm out here trying to record uh, where it's quiet. Yeah, and where I won't disturb anyone. So here you go. You've had a lot of interesting settings for my videos, and this is for sure a new one. So enjoy. All right. Well, let's see. Let's begin with uh, talking about the times in which these works and authors that we're studying occur in. All right, so what can I say about the later 20th century and contemporary times? Most of you have actually lived through much of this time period, or at least, well, maybe not quite much of this time period, but at least the contemporary times, right? You may not have been alive, many of you, in the 20th century, right? And think about that. Or maybe you were, but maybe it was the tail end of the 20th century. But nevertheless, here we are. I will highlight some of the most significant shaping moments and movements from this time period because if you weren't alive during at least the later 20th century, you probably need that overview. And if you were alive, you maybe were very young. So an overview could help for that too. All right, well, let's start way back when where we left off when we were talking about earlier 20th century times. We were talking about how the stock market crash of 1929 ushered the Great Depression of the 1930s. So I'm sure you've heard of that era, right? The Great Depression. Well, there was so much speculation, so many good times happening in the 1920s after, World War One ended and the 1918 flu pandemic ended. So finally, things were back to normal and people wanted to enjoy life. And that drove up speculation in the stock market. Well, that speculation came to a crashing halt in 1929 when people realized, oh, it's kind of like what happened, more recently, like in 2008, where we had the housing crisis. People were putting money down on futures so much, and subprime mortgages were happening. So it was like not evaluating the money that people were putting down on things and giving them credit for it. And that all kind of came to a spiral. I mean, it all spiraled downward and came to a crashing halt when people realized, oh, there's not enough capital in this market. People own things and prices have been driven up far more than they're actually valued. And so that's what happened when people were buying things on speculation in the stock market. Eventually, the prices spiraled up high enough. People didn't have enough capital in that for what they were buying. So what they were buying was worth so much more than what they were paying. Or they were paying inflated prices, above the value of what they were buying. But again, there was a lot of like credit and speculation involved, and that came to a crashing halt when the stock market crashed in 1929. Um, and during the 1930s, the Great Depression, 25% of America's adult working population was unemployed. I mean, I don't think I've ever lived through a time period in America's history when 25% of people who wanted jobs couldn't find jobs. That's typically what you call, the unemployment rate is when people who are looking for jobs can't find them. So 25% of America's adult working population was unemployed. So to compound matters, harsh environmental conditions ruined crops in the Oklahoma Dust Bowl. So it's called the Dust Bowl because like it was so dry that the soil came very like loose. It wasn't like glued down with it wasn't like moist soil. And so it was blowing around really badly. That's why you call it the Dust Bowl. And they couldn't grow crops there because the soil wasn't moist enough, or healthy enough. Masses of people migrated to California in pursuit of greener pastures. literally greener pastures, right? Because farmers, and it was, you still had quite an agrarian economy in that, Oklahoma area for sure. Um, and they could not make a living if they couldn't plant their crops and grow them and sell them. Masses of people were unemployed, couldn't grow crops. To ameliorate mass poverty, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time, he enacted the most sweeping socialist programs the country had ever seen. Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, etc. And a lot of things that we had built then were huge government projects that were enacted then, and we still benefit from them nowadays. Like a lot of highways were built then. A lot of beautiful buildings that were historic, on like, historic national lands, or at least lands that people thought, were so beautiful that they needed a building that people could come to enjoy it. And this time period was memorialized in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, that book. It's also been made into a movie. You may be familiar with it. It was basically Okies, quote unquote. Those are the people that live in Oklahoma that, had the Dust Bowl. They couldn't make a go of it, so they traveled. It was a family of Oakleys who traveled to California to try to, find work there, because there were promises that, oh, California was better, there's work there. And there are government camps there, spawned by things like, yes, the sweeping socialist programs that were government projects where the government would invest in it, and then they would hire workers and pay them to do jobs that the government needed done, like build dams, build buildings, build highways, build electrical plants, things like that. um, so it was, a smart idea to invest in the infrastructure of the country that was lacking with government funds to pay people who were unemployed. So anyway, that family, it's the Joad family, the family of Okies, traveled from Oklahoma. This is in The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, to California in hopes of greener pastures and work, better conditions. The oppressive financial and economic pressures in the United States also paralleled and contributed to similar conditions actually across the whole world. So it wasn't a good time across the entire world. This downward spiral was so dizzying that the United States did not fully recover until World War II. And of course, World War II started in 1941. So that was a long time for the country to endure mass unemployment, poverty, hunger, just absolute dizzying conditions. And that generation that was born then or lived through it, they became very frugal. They had to make every penny count, literally. And so, I don't know if you have grandparents from that era, but they were raised to be very frugal, to get the most out of everything, because they didn't know when their next penny or dime would come about again. So they made do, made use, repaired things, multi-purpose things. Um, Fascism. Oh, I'm sorry, before I talk about fascism, so World War II, of course, had its own panoply of problems. Fascism arose in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Those countries became militarized, and they took over other countries, and that was playing on people's fears at that time, right? Like these fascist. So fascist means when you're concentrating power all in one small group, like a dictator, or a particular political party, like the Nazis in Germany. These groups or these leaders would promise to bring back prosperity, and people, they were desperate, and so they're like, okay, if these people are promising a solution, all right, let's vote them into power, or let's let them take power. And so that's how you had these dictators take over in Germany. And when, of course, in Japan, you had an emperor, Emperor Hirohito. And in Italy, of course, you had Mussolini, who took over. Um, I believe he took over in the 1920s, and then Hitler took over in the 1930s in Germany, and they promised, to get things back in working order again. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran on that same plan for it. It was called a New Deal, right? A New Deal to revitalize America, and he had all of these socialist programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, the CCC is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the TVA for the Tennessee Valley Authority, all of these ways to revitalize the economy, provide necessary infrastructure, and put people back to work, at least for the time being. So, it was happening in America where socialist programs were promising to revitalize the country, except in America, we had democracy, so we had the chance to vote out our president. Although we did not, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, he actually was the longest ruling president in U.S. history. He was elected 4 terms. In fact, because he was elected 4 terms, we had Congress passed an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that said, okay, no more four-term presidents. Presidents can only be elected for 2 terms. So they could actually sort of a little more than 2 terms. Not 2 full terms, but like if they were a vice president and replaced the president, or somehow replaced the president, they could be elected for 2 more terms. So they could only be elected for 2 terms total, because FDR served for so long. Four terms. That's almost 16 years, because he died in the middle of his, or not in the middle, but towards the end of his 4th term. Um, but he kept promising consistency, right? Because the country was not only going through the Great Depression, but then at the end of the Great Depression, we had started World War II, which went from 1941 to 1945. And so, he had done a lot for the country. He had brought in these sweeping socialist programs that helped people a lot, but also he promised consistency during the war effort too. And so people wanted to go with what they knew and what they trusted versus the unknown, right? And the unproven, the untested. So that's why he kept getting voted back into office. It very much appealed to the people at that time. But if that's surprising to you that a president served for almost 4 terms in the U.S., you can understand why maybe fascism appealed to people in Germany and Italy at this time, where they were like, okay, these people are promising socialist programs that will revitalize my economy. So and hopefully make my life better. So they voted in who became these leaders who became dictators. They concentrated the power in themselves and their party, their specialist parties, and they, did a lot of harm, right? They did do a lot of harm. We fortunately did not suffer from that same harm here in America. All right. Well, hmm. Those, the Allied countries, those are the ones that opposed the fascist countries, the ones that were the Axis powers during World War II. So the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan. They bonded together in the war effort, and they were trying to take over the world. They went from country to country trying to capture them and make them part of their, I don't know, empire, I guess you would say is what they're trying to go for. And then the countries like the United States and England, France, Russia, etc. Yes, even Russia was our ally during World War II. We were fighting those Axis powers. We were fighting the countries that they were taking over. We rose up to combat these virulently imperialist powers. Much more nefarious was Hitler in Germany, who established concentration camps and death camps to rid his country of the ethnic groups that he did not like quote unquote gypsies. We don't call them gypsies nowadays, but that was their nickname back then, but we might call them the Romani population now. And also they were trying to get out religious groups they didn't like, the Jews, and homosexual and intellectual groups. Also, they were trying to get rid of the disabled population. So it targeted the Jews especially, but also ethnic Slavs and Gypsies or Romani that they did not like, homosexual groups, intellectual groups, people that were too well educated, and disabled populations. because they believed in the pure race, right? Like they were trying to create this master race that was perfect, so to speak, to them by their standards. But of course,